Hey, hello, and welcome to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. This week, our guest is former United States Senator and Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen. Remember, we love taking your questions, so write into politicswarroom@gmail.com or send a tweet to @Politicon for next week's show. We'll get to as many as we can, but don't forget to tell us where you're from. Please tell your friends about us. Remind them to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. James, we need to talk about abortion again this week. If that draft Alito opinion overturning Roe protections holds, it'll be very costly, with a price paid almost exclusively by poor and working class women, and that's not what the country wants. Therefore, ending this 49-year protection should be politically helpful for Democrats. Even more so when Mitch McConnell says, well, there could be a federal ban, not just the states that ban abortion. And others talk about banning birth control devices, setting up an inspection force to block mail of FDA-approved pills. However, and let me emphasize, however, it will not if some of these pro-choice elements focus on big demonstrations, marches, picketing the homes of Supreme Court justices. They're all permissible. They're also stupid or counterproductive. If they really want to make a difference, they really want to wage this fight and on equal grounds with the other side that has won so much, go and go down to Dayton, Ohio, or Erie, Pennsylvania, or Greensboro, North Carolina, where there are big Senate races. North Carolina has a Supreme Court race that will decide the fate of abortion in that state, or go to Michigan. If you can't go, help those who can go. The need to mobilize, persuade, and register voters. This is not going to succeed, I think you will agree, James, on the streets. It can in the political arena if they work as hard as the other side. So far, it's a little bit discouraging.
Precisely and exactly. And the reason is these are some of the most ineffective, the progressive advocacy groups are the most ineffective people in the entire Washington metropolitan area. And the reason is they never get out. So if it's convenient, if Justice Alito or Senator Collins live, within 10 minutes of Northwest Washington, they can inconvenience themselves. But the idea that anybody in these progressive advocacy groups would go to Greensboro, North Carolina and register voters, or go to Dayton, Ohio and, knock on doors to help a campaign. Well, you don't expect me to do that, do you? And while they're out demonstrating or whatever they're doing in Northwest Washington, the pro-life people are organizing, are pushing and running people for the school board and God knows what not. This is a staggering defeat for these groups, and the sooner they realize it, the better off they're going to be. But I don't think they'll ever realize it. I think their entire life is about staying as close to their cultural comfort zone as they possibly can. That's my view.
Yeah, and I agree with you, unfortunately. And I think for the politicians out there, this should be about Roe. This should be about banning abortion. And don't get caught up in the question of no limits whatsoever. If somebody wants to have an abortion at 37 weeks, fine. I mean, that test the court had a viability. Any abortion ought to be legal up to viability, and after that, it ought to be legal only under very carefully prescribed prescriptions. But you don't want to get into that debate. This is about don't let the other side dominate you in that. Yeah. This is a debate where you have the high ground, you have the popular ground, and keep it on that. Some of them already aren't doing that very well, James.
Well, now, I think there is one place you can expand, and that is the right of privacy, which people assume that we have in this country, which is not an enumerated right, which is a right that the courts have given us as to their reading of the Constitution. Justice Alito famously said there's no enumerated right to have an abortion in the Constitution, ergo, why can't a state outlaw it? Well, there's no enumerated right to have sex in the Constitution. There's no enumerated right to be married in the Constitution. It's not an enumerated right. So by that reasoning, and they're pretty clear, they're going to outlaw contraception in Mississippi. They have reported a bill out of committee, I think it was 7-2 in Louisiana, that would make getting abortion a homicide. So I'm going to watch a 20-year-old weeping female, going to, well, actually the women's penitentiary is in St. Gabriel, where I grew up in Louisiana. That's how crazy this is. Oklahoma, no life of the mother exception. And they're going to do it. They get the Senate. They'll get rid of the filibuster so fast your head will swim to pass a national law banning all abortions. And this has happened in spite of the fact that over 2-to-1 people in the country don't want it to happen because the organizing groups around the pro-choice movement are pathetic.
And despite what Justice Alito writes in that draft opinion, I think you touched on there aren't enumerated rights, and if a gay marriage has to be under threat if this happens.
Well,
There's
sure
just no
it
question
is.
about that. I mean, if you can revisit a 49-year
What about interracial
precedent,
marriage?
why can't you? Absolutely. Well, I guess that was that's 54 years, but I don't think they'll be limited by that.
Maybe they can do the
57.
Thomas exception.
Yeah, exactly.
Carve out. Do a carve out.
Well, it's there's so much at stake here, and to sit back and not fight this is just would be a tragedy.
Pregnancies very often are complicated, and if you are thinking about getting pregnant, or your spouse, or somebody in your family, or your daughter, get a lawyer. If you live in any of these states, get a lawyer, because they'll throw your daughter in jail. I'm serious.
Well,
it's not a like.
No, I know
okay,
you
we
are.
have sex and then 9 months later we have a baby. It happens like that sometimes, but in a lot of instances, there's a lot of tough decisions that physicians and females have to make.
Well, the other thing
now the legislature's looking at it.
That, as the fabled Barney Frank said years ago, that some of these pro-life people are all for life from conception to birth. And if there are children who are born because their abortion is outlawed, I want to know where they're going to be on a child tax credit. I want to know where they're going to be on child care. I want to know where they're going to be on pre-K. I think we know the answer to that.
We've gone through that. They don't care. Until we realize that, they have no fear of any organization or organizing principle that are in favor of having women have reproductive rights. They just don't care. And again, as I said it on television, they know that they're going to sit around and talk about veganism and pronouns and how can they protect their turf in Washington. They're not going to go to the Mississippi Delta and register voters. They're not going to go, to Arizona. And you think I'm going out there that summer heat to campaign? You must be crazy. I gotta, I'm going to the vineyard. So maybe they can have a meeting at the vineyard.
Some politics this week. A couple primaries, not the biggest ones, Nebraska and West Virginia. The focus, as always, in the Republican primaries is on Trump. He had a split decision. The guy he was supporting for governor of Nebraska, he is a bull semen baron and a serial molester of women, according to accusations. He lost, so he couldn't deliver it for the bull semen guy, but he won a big congressional contest between two Republicans in West Virginia, one of whom, the winner he was supporting, the other of whom was supported by the governor and Joe Manchin. So, he's still a force.
The one race, that I think is significant, and it says something, but we don't hear a lot about it because it doesn't say what a lot of people want to hear. A lot of people that cover this, and that is the Cleveland Democratic primary, where Nina Turner, again, a firebrand progressive of the first order, co-chairman of Bernie Sanders' campaign, Chantrell Brown beat her by 6 points the last time they ran. This time, she beat it by 30. All right? Actually, I think it might, maybe, if anything, a little more than 30.
It was actually 40.
Yes.
It may have been 40,
so that gives you a real-time example of how the progressive left stands in a Democratic Party. She got slaughtered. All right? And it was a rematch. And, of course, Nina Turner on election night says, this encourages me to run for president. So you got 32% in Cleveland, and you're going to run for president? I mean, no, you can't say anything, but when are these people going to get the clue that no one likes them? I don't know. I tell you what, they're suckers for pain.
You can say delusional.
I'm telling
But you're
you,
absolutely
man.
right. Okay, we'll be back next week, and that's after the Pennsylvania primary. That is a big one,
Ooh.
so we'll watch that very
Man, that
carefully.
could be a hang on, dude.
I have no idea what's happening. I talked to people a week ago, mainly about the Democrats, and they said the Republican contest, they were talking about Dr. Oz and David McCormick, his hedge fund guy turned Trumpite, and suddenly this black right-wing Trump-supporting woman has come out of nowhere, and she's a threat. So it's going to
Yeah,
be,
she's Trumpier than Trump.
this may be the Kentucky Derby of politics this year,
Could be.
James.
I'm telling you, man. Striking me. I mean, I was in Las Vegas at a race. That was incredible. Like that guy,
Yeah.
Sonny Leon, he was one of the great. He rode a hell of a race.
He was a hell of a jockey, and that pony shouldn't have gotten in the way of that horse. So anyway,
Right.
All right. Next week, tune in. We'll be doing Pennsylvania.
For sure.
James, one of the foremost experts on national security and politics is Bill Cohen, former defense secretary, 24 years in Congress, three-term Republican senator from the state of Maine. Mr. Secretary, it is so good to have you with us today. Let's start with Ukraine, because there certainly are mixed signals. Putin's May 9th speech was less aggressive than some thought, though he spun out a lot of lies. But the Russians are gaining territory and the Donbass and moving west. What's your current assessment?
Well, in the long term, I think that the weight will favor the Russians here. It's not that they are confident, but they've added to their lack of confidence by having just the sheer numbers of soldiers and weaponry they have access to. So I'd say, in terms of the immediate term, we're likely to see more gains by the Russians. The Ukrainians are fighting back for every inch that they can. Their problem is, at this particular point, the logistics supply line. So I would say, in the short term, the Russians will continue to move forward slowly but surely, and then the Ukrainians are going to have to, at that point, fight for every inch they can get back. So I'd say the odds are favoring the Russians at this point. Whether or not that will continue remains to be seen. I think the Ukrainians are obviously getting better equipment. I don't know if it's getting there in time for them right now.
Well, I was going to say, what can NATO and the U.S. do to expedite, to help more, to try to stem this slow tide?
Well, I don't think that there is much we can do in the short term. Those supply lines the rail lines are being hit, and that means that the Ukrainians are going to have to find other routes that they're going to have to work around and go off the road, et cetera. Some of that equipment can be moved in by helicopter, but the danger there is that the helicopters can be seen and attacked. They could move at nighttime, but that presents its own logistical problem. So I think it's going to be time to get it all there, and I don't know in terms of how much territory the Russians can gain. I would think that what Putin would do in the near future would be to say, I have, quote, denazified Ukraine, tell that lie over and over again. I have taken Mariupol. I am taking control of the Donbass, and so I'm declaring victory, and now I'm calling for a ceasefire. At that point, if he were to do that, it presents a real challenge to President Zelensky. At that point, Zelensky has to say, no ceasefire. You took my home, my territory, and I'm fighting back. So then that presents a political problem for Zelensky, saying, wait a minute, Putin has called for a ceasefire. You want to continue the fighting. Perhaps we ought to help negotiate a deal here so that more people don't die, more Ukrainians don't die, and that we can ease up on these sanctions. I don't know that the Europeans or the United States would agree to that, but that would be a move that Putin could do and put more pressure on the West and on Zelensky.
A lot harder for Zelensky to accept that, isn't it? because of the Russian brutality. I mean, part of that may have been easier a month or so ago.
Right. No, it'd absolutely be very hard for him to accept. And the real issue is, how much staying power does the West have? Right now, we're seeing the Biden administration being hammered by inflation. Gas prices on the West Coast, at least for regular, are up $6 or more. Inflation is still at 8+%. And as we're moving into the summer months of travel, all of these issues will come to the fore. And again, Putin can say, hey, I've done what I wanted to do, and now let's talk about a ceasefire. I think that's almost impossible for Zelensky, but if you're playing the mind game, Putin is saying, I've got the territory I want for now. I can declare victory and still continue at any time I want to resume the fighting. Your call, President Zelensky.
James.
So Mr. Secretary, there's a lot of activity in the Formosan Strait right now. Are you concerned that the Chinese might try to pull the same thing in Taiwan that the Russians pulled in Ukraine?
I think that's unlikely. I think what they are probably more surprised about is to see the solidarity that the Europeans and NATO countries have been able to marshal on very short time frame. They have been attempting, and their desire is to separate the Europeans from the United States. So to see the NATO countries come together in this fashion to oppose Putin, for them to take this step that would be seen as being comparable to what Putin has done, I think would cause them some pause here. I mean, you even have Singapore joining with the West in the condemnation of what Putin is doing. Singapore is part of the whole Indo-China Pacific. So it's possible they could do it. I think they'd be reluctant at this point. I think they want to see how this is all going to play out. Secondly, there's always the chance that the United States and the West could seek to impose sanctions against China. I don't think they want that at this point. Their economy is not doing well. And from all that I've been able to gather in terms of information, their growth rate is down around 4%, 4.4%, which sounds good to us. But in terms of a country who has until recently had 8%, then 6%, 5%, now 4%, plus COVID, I think that that would be a challenge for them to see the kind of reaction it would produce on the part of the rest of the world. Anything is possible. I just think it's rather unlikely now, even though they're inclined to show their strength by have flyovers over Taiwan, keep them on the edge. I think it would probably be a miscalculation if they were to go forward. But it's anybody's guess, James, at this point.
So the CEO of Volkswagen kind of insinuated that they should have a negotiated settlement, which is do you worry there's going to be a crack in the resolve in Western Europe, and we prematurely bring this to an end?
Well, I think, as you and Al have pointed out, right now the wounds are so raw and so ugly from what they have done in the way of war crimes. I think it would be very difficult to have a negotiated settlement at this point. I think the West would say, we're going to give Zelensky an opportunity to claw back that territory. We're hoping that weaponry can get through, that we can cause more casualties on the part of the Russians, that we can get more really combat equipment in there. But to try to negotiate at this point and put pressure on Zelensky, I think it would be very hard. I don't think the West would be eager to do that. But as you move into the summer months, travel months, and then start to get into the autumn, we've got elections coming up. The question is, how firm would the U.S. be? We've got people in the United States Congress who are pro-Putin. You've got media in this country who are pro-Putin. And so how would that play going into our own elections in November? Hard to predict at this point. So far, the Republicans have held together with the Democrats. Whether or not that will be a split in the fall, given, again, inflation is likely to remain high, Oil prices are unlikely to come down in the near term. No matter what the West is able to do, I don't think the Europeans are going to be able to cut back dramatically, certainly before the end of the year. So at this particular point, again, Putin can say, I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing. And then if I call for a ceasefire, it's up to you to see whether or not you're ready for it. I don't think we would, but I think this is part of the game he can play.
Thank you, sir. Albert?
Senator, I started to say Senator. You're still a senator, so I can say Senator or Mr. Secretary. There have been some remarkable revelations about the former President Donald Trump lately. Mark Esper, who was his defense secretary, and we all thought a Trump loyalist, he was, said that he at one point suggested let's fire missiles at Mexico. He himself said, maybe we ought to go and get a warplane and put Chinese emblems on it and bomb Russia. They'll think the Chinese did it. He wanted to court-martial some great American generals and admirals, William McRaven and Stanley McChrystal. How dangerous, how much worse would it be if Trump came back, do you think?
I think at that particular point, we would see the demise of the rule of law in its totality. We, at least most of us who watched Trump during the primary campaign, some of the things he was saying at that particular point, you remember he was asking his rallies, which looked unlike any rallies I've seen in my recent years in politics, but nonetheless, take those protesters, body slam them if you can. That's what we used to do, or I'd recommend doing it. By the way, if you get sued, I'll pay your legal bills. Or if you arrest people, make sure the police bang their heads on the car, at the rear of the car, on their way into the back seat. Those kinds of things were said at that time. So it was not surprising to me, once he got into office, that he would take that kind of aggression and try to use it against anyone who was at all critical. And as I pointed out recently, when they had the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and resistance to the police up in the state of Washington, what happened? He deployed some of our federal agents in unmarked uniforms, almost like ninja suits, and he was allowing them to fire rubber bullets into the protesters. One protester got hit in the head by one of the sharpshooters or snipers. And then they were detaining and arresting people, throwing into unmarked vehicles and taking them to the police stations without charging them. That pretty much is a police state action that he was taking at that time. So then you get to Trafalgar Square and you see the generally peaceful protesting, and he marches out with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense and really uses force against those protesters. I think if he were to get back into office, we would see all limitations released and removed. He wouldn't have to account to anyone. He's not running, can't run again. He would put in place the people who would, I think, yield to him. They wouldn't take that position unless they were his supporters, and he wouldn't put them on unless they were dedicated fealty, kissed the ring, et cetera, and praised his genius status. So I think that we as a country would be in jeopardy of saying that we're a democracy that believes in the rule of law.
So why have so few members of your party, your former party at least, the Republicans, been willing to stand up and say this is a existential threat?
I think that they prefer power over the rule of law. I think they do not respect the institutions in which they serve. I think that they are abdicating their responsibility of their oath of office to serve the Constitution and not an individual. Trump has made no mistake about what he wants. He wants my generals, my judges, my justices, my Secretary of State, my FBI, et cetera. So we know what he wants, and I think the people who agree to serve him would be those who are likely to carry out his orders. Fortunately, Mark Esper, at that moment when he received not an order, he said he didn't get an order, but he was trying to preclude receiving an order, but said, I will not, under any circumstances at this moment in time, support invoking the Insurrection Act. And once he said that, he knew that he would be fired, and he was. Because there was talk, as you remember, that Lieutenant General Flynn was in the White House talking about the need for the Insurrection Act. And we've seen from the January 6th committee, they have been peeling back the lies and deceptions of the Republican Party and President Trump supporters. So Mark Esper did the right thing in saying I wouldn't support any kind of order like that. And remember that Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, Marines, and James, you know this, Marines don't quit. Jim Mattis is a warrior. He didn't quit, but he did quit President Trump because he said he could no longer support the president who had a worldview very different from his. That's pretty unusual. I would say the same thing for General Kelly, another 4-star Marine, to say we really can't serve this man. So I think we were saved by a threadbare here on January 6th. And I think to the extent that my party doesn't believe in the need to call out and say, President Trump, former President Trump, under no circumstances could we support you, no matter what your popularity is. It would be a threat to the rule of law. I think Mark Esper said it most recently on one of his television interviews. I think every Republican who believes in the rule of law has to say the same thing.
Wow. Well,
I just want to kick just one question before I leave for the Secretary, please. If you following this brouhaha in the Marine Corps about changing the mission and the fact that 3 retired generals write an op-ed seemed to me to be pretty extraordinary.
It is. Now, this is a debate that ought to be had within the department. This is not something to be played out and saying which generals are on which side of this. What the role of the Marine Corps is going to be going forward into a new world, and whether or not that mission should change from what it has been to one that resembles more along the lines of an army or some other combination. I would have that debate within the Pentagon to say we need to clarify what our roles and missions are. And if circumstances dictate that we need to change, okay, fair debate. I don't think it ought to be playing out in public, and I don't think that this is something that is helpful.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. How to you?
Always good to be with you.
Bill Cohen, you are a great guest as always. You're a repeat offender. You've been back 5 or 6 times, and we enjoy it every time. So we're going to have you back again. Awful good to see you. Say hi to your wife.
I'll see you soon, Al. And James, I always enjoy seeing you. Okay. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Hey, James, our first question from a lot of good ones is from Gary in Gold Country, Placerville, California. Man, I don't know where that is, but he can let us know.
That's somewhere in Sacramento, but I don't know.
Well, it sounds like that. Doesn't sound like it's on the coast. He says, why is Biden holding on getting rid of the filibuster? He's giving it a law. It's not really getting anywhere. The way this Republican Party is becoming so radicalized, isn't it time to pull all the stops and start biting, kicking, scratching, punching?
Well, Biden can't get rid of the filibuster.
Yeah.
Right. He would like to, but as long as Manchin and Sinema don't want to get rid of it, you can't get rid of it. And that's a consequence of having a 50-50 Senate. If we got out of Washington campaign and, we got a fairly favorable Senate map this year. You're not going to have a very good one in 2024. We got to hold the Senate or maybe add a couple of seats, and it's going to be extremely difficult. But to get mad at Biden for the filibuster doesn't. But he would love to have gotten rid of it.
Right.
I mean,
you got to add. You got to add to that Senate this year. You got to pick up a net of 2 or 3 seats.
Yes.
That's a challenge, but you got to do that. Our next question is from Blair in Morristown, New Jersey, formerly of Paoli, where he says, Hoops Hunt, which was the nickname I had, was a well-known name in his prime. Blair, I ain't in my prime anymore. I don't have a nickname anymore. Blair says, is one of those, hopefully not elite, who have been to more than my share of highbrow events where we think we know it all and cannot fathom why people don't think like we do, with good intentions. But if I am of a certain age and past my canvassing prime, you too, Blair, past your prime, where should I be directing my focus and dollars? You know, we talked about that last week, James, and in that case, he can find certain candidates that you know you want to give to. I mean, Blair, if you're in Morristown, New Jersey, right next door in Pennsylvania, there's a couple big congressional races and Senate races. You may have a congressional race there, and state parties in Michigan, in North Carolina, and in other places.
You know, yeah, Blair, Morristown, I've been there many times, taking a train into the city from there. It's beautiful. Morristown, New Jersey is gorgeous. People don't realize what a beautiful state New Jersey is, and I tell them that. And, oh, no, what do you mean? I went from the Newark airport to. That's not. Yeah. That's not what it is. What I recommend is adopt a couple of races, and it can be something unconventional. Mallory Morrow was on the show talking about some of these critical state Senate races in Michigan, or the Secretary of State race somewhere. And when you adopt a race, you can follow it. If you have a little money, you can target it to right where you think it'll be more effective. You can bookmark the local news and read about it every day. And, you know, you can call the campaign and say, can you give me a call list of, you know, GOTV calls I can make? There's actually a lot you can do. And I always recommend that people do their own research and maybe adopt a campaign that people wouldn't ordinarily think of. And, you know, I would be way more into the Secretary of State in Michigan race than I would be somebody raising $7 billion to beat Marjorie Taylor Greene, which is not going to happen. Yeah. So that's what I would say to any of our listeners. If you retired or you have extra time and you're interested in politics, adopt a race and then follow it.
An attorney general's race and state Supreme Court. Those are big.
A critical state legislative seat can be huge. And trust me, the pro-life people are out there organizing like crazy. Richard
in Jersey, Channel Islands, France. Oh, wow. I love to hear from our French fans.
Jersey Channel. That's in the Channel Islands?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know one of them.
Should Biden push Kamala Harris as the point person on the rejection of Roe and Casey so the administration is represented by a female voice? Well, I think she certainly ought to have a big voice in this, but there are going to be a number of voices. This is not one where there's going to be a national megaphone that's going to determine everything. I think Biden and Harris ought to speak out on it, as will others. And the battles are going to be fought, as we said earlier, in Pennsylvania and Michigan and North Carolina and Georgia and Ohio. That's where you fight these battles.
Yeah, and you know, I think to the extent that messaging about the right to privacy and you know Roe and the disruptions in lives can be effective, and I mean certainly the vice president can make those points, but you know there's other thing. Males can make the point too. I mean it's but yes, and she and Harris, you know, maybe she can find a footing on this issue.
Yeah, exactly. Jane, finally, Shane in Minneapolis, Minnesota, says, I'm going to follow up an excellent analogy from this week's show and ask, if the Democrats' farm team is strong and the bench is deep, if the class of 2018 is full of all-stars, what are the Democrats missing? A coach, a team manager, what?
It's very good because the class of 18 did have a bunch of all-stars, and, some of them are going to be running, and you're going to be hearing more and more from them. But the problem is what the party needs, you know, our president is 78, our speaker is 80, our Schumer's in his 70s. I mean, we need to bring up and nurture and mentor a whole new generation of Democratic leadership, and I think the country would be ready for it. And I know some of these younger people, assuming they don't get crushed in the 2022 election, are really up to the job to go do great things and be great people.
I agree with you totally, with one caveat. If the Democrats should barely cling on to the House, go for two more, Nancy. You're the only person that can keep it together.
That might be, but if they should.
But that doesn't detract from your point. Let some of those impressive young people.
You know, the grave. We just got to get to something else. I mean, Hakeem, he's just got to be up to the job if he gets it, and most people think he is.
Yeah.
But you just the churn of life is just got to take place.
Right. All right, James, now for the outrage of the week. You know, the radical right, with their hate and violence, poses a far greater danger to America than the fringe left. But the woke left can drive you crazy. At Yale Law School recently, a right-wing speaker who opposes abortion, gay marriage, and transgender women participating in sports was shouted down by Yale Law students at a forum. Now, I think she's terribly wrong, this speaker, on all fronts. Gay marriage is now accepted by most Americans. When two people love each other, marriage is a stabilizing force. Abortion is not easy, but it's better left to a woman and her doctor. And as for transgenders, what do they wish them? What sport do they wish them to participate in? But, you know, probably a third to 40% of Americans disagree with me on that. That's their voice is one that should be heard by Yale Law students respectfully and then refuted forcefully. There are limits to free speech, a few, not many, fire in a crowded theater. But unlike the pervasive hate groups, the woke left is pretty much limited to elite universities and some coastal and media venues. But those woke Yaleys enable critics on the other side to distract from their own problems and point to silly stuff like shouting down a speaker at the Yale Law School. Grow up. You're supposed to be the future of the law profession in America.
Yeah, I'll amplify because, too, like Bernie Sanders is more our generation. He's actually doesn't believe in shutting speech down. That's an old thing. If you were a liberal, everybody had to have their say. Mm-hmm. And now it's become, it's only the oppressed have a right to speak out. Oppressors are not allowed. I don't know what that means. And I don't know, universities of all places should be, a general idea, you have tenure, you have things that you should be comfortable with people saying uncomfortable things. And it's become, it's an annoyance, and many times more than its actual problem, but it is an annoyance, and I just don't get why you would shut any view down. I've always told my students I would bring David Duke if I wouldn't think the university would crap a pineapple.
Because when you hear him, he's so goddamn stupid that you want to have him.
Right, and if my students are not, if you persuade about David Duke, I'm a poor teacher. But I'm not keeping anything away from you. But I agree, and Yale is, obviously a, uber top tier place, and the fact that they engage in this kind of behavior, you'd think they'd know better.
Yeah, you do. Hey, thanks for listening to Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. Don't forget to send your questions for us by email to politicswarroom@gmail.com or tweet them for next week's show at Politicon. To keep up with us, subscribe to Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. Please rate the show with a 5-star review. We'll be back next week with another show as we continue our War Room planning.